Imagine standing on the misty shores of northern Scotland, the salt-laden wind whipping against your face as you stare at ancient stone carvings, bizarre symbols of crescents, rods, double discs, and strange animal figures etched by human hands over a millennium ago. These enigmatic markings are all that remain of a people who vanished from written history around 900 CE, leaving behind no texts, no clear linguistic record, and no definitive explanation of who they were or where they went. The Picts, Scotland's most enduring mystery. For centuries, these ghost-like ancestors haunted Scottish history as shadowy warriors who emerged from the mist to battle Romans, Vikings, and eventually merged into obscurity. Their name itself comes not from their own language but from Roman texts, Pictii, the painted ones, describing their tattooed or painted bodies. But who were they really? Indigenous inhabitants? Celtic cousins? Scandinavian migrants? The theories were as numerous as they were contradictory. That is, until 2018, when a team of geneticists from the University of Aberdeen made a breakthrough that would shatter 1,200 years of assumptions. Hidden within the DNA of modern Scottish inhabitants lay a genetic signature, not just any signature, but one that potentially rewrites the entire origin story of Scotland's mysterious Picts. The truth, it seems, had been hiding within us all along. The story begins in 1955 when archaeologist Isabel Linford stood in the pouring rain at Aberlemno, a small Scottish village in Angus, staring at what locals called the Serpent's Stone. The rain traced the outline of a carved snake, zirod, and double disc, quintessential Pictish symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. As she sketched the weathered symbol, she couldn't have known that 60 years later, her great-niece, Dr. Rachel Zimmerman, would be analyzing DNA samples that would finally offer answers to questions Isabel never saw resolved. My great-aunt spent her entire career trying to piece together who the Picts were from stones and archaeological fragments. Dr. Zimmerman told me as we walked the same site in 2022. She died believing we would never truly know. I wish she could see what DNA has revealed. To understand the magnitude of this genetic revelation, we first need to understand who the Picts were in the historical record. Between approximately 300 to 900 CE, they dominated what is now northern and eastern Scotland. The Romans described them as fierce warriors who stopped the empire's northern advance, effectively making Hadrian's Wall necessary. The Venerable Bede, writing in the 8th century, described them as one of the four peoples of Britain alongside the English, Britons, and Scots. But unlike their contemporaries, the Picts left behind no written language beyond those mysterious carved symbols found on hundreds of stone monuments across Scotland. They left no texts explaining their customs, no historical chronicles, no clear linguistic legacy that scholars could definitively identify. When their kingdom merged with the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada around 900 CE to form the Kingdom of Alba, the precursor to Scotland, the distinct Pictish identity seemingly vanished overnight. Professor Ian Lockhart of Edinburgh University, who has studied Pictish archaeology for over 3 decades, explains the predicament. It's as if an entire people agreed to collectively disappear from history. Their symbols remain, their burial sites remain, but their voice, who they said they were, that vanished. That's what makes the Picts so fascinating and frustrating for historians. Traditional archaeology had provided tantalizing clues. We know they built sophisticated underground stone houses called souterrains, created intricate silver jewelry, and developed a complex society with kings and an apparent aristocracy. But fundamental questions remained. Were they indigenous to Scotland? Were they Celtic like their neighbors? Did they speak a Celtic language or something entirely different? Did they truly disappear, or did they simply assimilate? By the early 2000s, a scientific revolution was brewing that would change everything: the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA from archaeological remains. Suddenly, the dead could speak again, not through texts or artifacts, but through the genetic code preserved in their bones. And the story they would tell about the Picts would challenge everything we thought we knew. The question that would launch us into the next phase of discovery was deceptively simple yet profound. What if the Picts weren't who we thought they were at all? What if their true origin had been hiding in plain sight for over a millennium? In September 2016, Dr. Rachel Zimmerman received a call that would change her career trajectory. As a geneticist specializing in population migrations at the University of Aberdeen, she had been working on tracing Viking genetic signatures across the North Sea regions when her department chair asked her to join a classified project. The call came on a Tuesday, she recalls. By Friday, I was standing in a secure laboratory staring at 6 sets of remains excavated from a previously undisturbed burial site near Portmahomac, what we believe was once a major Pictish monastery. The Portmahomac discovery was extraordinary, carbon-dated to approximately 650 to 700 CE, the height of Pictish culture. The burial contained 6 individuals in a stone-lined grave marked with Pictish symbols. The preservation was remarkable, likely due to the unique soil chemistry of the area, which prevented excessive degradation of organic material. For archaeologists and geneticists, this was the equivalent of finding the proverbial needle in a haystack, intact Pictish DNA from a securely dated context. What made this find so exceptional was not just the preservation, explains Dr. Ian Lawson, the archaeologist who led the excavation, but the context. These weren't just any Picts. Based on the burial goods and location within the monastery grounds, these were likely elite individuals, perhaps even royalty. The man we designated PM3 was buried with a silver brooch bearing the double-disc symbol associated with Pictish nobility. The team set to work extracting DNA samples using the latest techniques developed for ancient DNA recovery. The process is painstaking. Contamination from modern DNA is a constant threat, and the samples themselves are often degraded after centuries underground. The genetic material exists in fragments that must be carefully amplified and reconstructed, like piecing together millions of tiny puzzle pieces. For months, the lab worked in secret, aware that their findings could potentially rewrite Scottish prehistory. The first results were confusing and prompted more questions than answers. The preliminary analysis showed something unexpected: genetic markers that didn't align neatly with either the indigenous British population or the Celtic groups from continental Europe that had migrated to the British Isles centuries earlier. Our first thought was contamination, Dr. Zimmerman admits. When you get results that don't match your expectations, the scientific instinct is to question your methodology. They repeated the extraction and sequencing process 3 more times. The results remained consistent. The Pictish samples contained genetic markers that showed 3 distinct influences. Approximately 40% aligned with indigenous British signatures, people who had inhabited the islands since after the last ice age. 35% matched continental Celtic populations, and, most surprisingly, 25% showed strong connections to populations from the steppe regions of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. This steppe signature was the bombshell. While archaeologists had long debated various origin theories for the Picts, nobody had seriously proposed a significant Eastern European or Central Asian component. Yet here it was in the DNA, unmistakable markers linking these Scottish nobles to the great nomadic cultures that had swept across the Eurasian steppe thousands of years earlier. To verify these findings, the team needed more samples. Working in collaboration with National Museum Scotland, they gained access to previously excavated remains from other Pictish sites across Scotland, from Dunrobin in the far north to Riney in Aberdeenshire. In total, they collected 67 samples of varying quality from securely identified Pictish contexts. The expanded dataset confirmed their initial findings but added new complexities. The steppe genetic signature appeared strongest in elite burials and weakened in common graves. Additionally, the percentage varied geographically, stronger in eastern Scotland than in western regions. This suggested a population that was not homogeneous but stratified, with the ruling class potentially having different origins than the people they governed. What we were seeing, explains Professor Richard Thomason of the Ancient Genomics Laboratory at Oxford, who was brought in to verify the Scottish team's findings, was evidence of a complex population history. The Picts weren't simply an indigenous people, nor were they just Celtic immigrants. Their genetic makeup told a story of multiple migrations and admixtures over thousands of years. To understand the implications, we need to step back and look at the broader European genetic landscape. Between 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a massive migration from the Eurasian steppe region transformed the genetic makeup of Europe. These migrants, associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture, brought with them new technologies, domesticated horses, and possibly Indo-European languages. Their genetic signature can be found across Europe, but it varies in concentration. In most of Western Europe, this steppe DNA accounts for roughly 10 to 15% of the genetic makeup of modern populations. The Pictish samples, however, showed significantly higher percentages, particularly among the elites. This raised a provocative question. Could the Picts, or at least their ruling class, represent a later, separate migration from the East that maintained a higher concentration of this ancestral DNA? Dr. Zimmerman's team turned to carbon dating to establish a timeline. The remains spanned from approximately 300 to 800 CE, the period when Pictish culture was at its height. But to understand when this Eastern genetic influence might have arrived, they needed comparative samples from pre-Pictish Scotland. Working with archaeologists, they identified several Bronze Age and Iron Age sites in the same regions. The results were illuminating. The steppe signature was present but at lower levels in the pre-Pictish samples, suggesting that while the initial Yamnaya migration had affected Scotland as it had the rest of Europe, there appeared to be a secondary influx that coincided with the emergence of Pictish culture. We began to develop a working hypothesis, Dr. Zimmerman explains. What if the people we know as Picts were formed by the arrival of a new group from the East who integrated with the existing population sometime around or before the Roman period? This could explain both the genetic signature and perhaps even the mysterious symbols that have no clear parallels in Celtic art. To test this theory, they needed to look beyond genetics to other forms of evidence. Dr. Imran Langley, a linguist specializing in ancient languages, had been attempting to decipher the limited Pictish language evidence for years. Most scholars had assumed the Pictish language was Celtic, related to Welsh, Gaelic, or Brythonic languages. But some linguists had long argued there were non-Celtic elements that couldn't be explained. The place names in eastern Scotland contain elements that have resisted Celtic etymology, Dr. Langley explains. Terms like pit, which appears in many Scottish place names like Pitlochry or Pittenweem, have no convincing Celtic origin. What if these linguistic anomalies were traces of a language brought by Eastern migrants? The team needed to expand their investigation beyond Scotland to see if similar genetic patterns existed elsewhere. They collaborated with research teams in northern England, Ireland, and Scandinavia to compare their Pictish samples with contemporaneous populations. The results added another layer to the mystery. The distinctive genetic profile they had identified in the Pictish samples appeared at much lower frequencies in Anglo-Saxon England and Ireland. However, interestingly, samples from early Viking Age Norway showed similar, though not identical, patterns of steppe ancestry. This raised the tantalizing possibility of earlier, pre-Viking connections between Scotland and Scandinavia. Could the Picts and early Norse populations share some common ancestry from the East that predated the Viking Age? The genetic evidence suggested this was possible. As they dug deeper into the data, more patterns emerged. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively through the maternal line, showed greater connections to indigenous British and Celtic populations, while the Y chromosome DNA, passed exclusively through the paternal line, showed stronger Eastern connections. This suggested a primarily male-dominated migration, a pattern seen in many historical population movements where male warriors or elites would move into a region and intermarry with local women. The timeline was becoming clearer. Sometime between 100 BCE and 100 CE, a population movement from the east, possibly from Scandinavia or through Scandinavia from points further east, had introduced new genetic material into what would become Pictland. These newcomers, likely a warrior elite, established themselves among the indigenous and Celtic populations, creating the hybrid culture we now identify as Pictish. This hypothesis would explain several archaeological mysteries. The sudden appearance of certain Pictish symbols that have no precedent in Celtic art. The linguistic anomalies that had puzzled experts for centuries. Even the Roman name for the people, painted ones, might relate to customs brought from the East, where body painting and tattooing had deep cultural significance among steppe populations. But a crucial question remained. If this theory was correct, why had no historical sources mentioned such a migration? Why had this origin story been lost while the movements of other peoples like the Angles, Saxons, and Vikings were well documented? The answer may lie in timing and literacy. This proposed migration would have occurred before widespread literacy reached northern Britain, during the chaotic period of late Roman influence. Unlike the later Anglo-Saxon and Viking incursions, which were recorded by Christian chroniclers, this earlier movement happened in what was effectively a prehistoric context for Scotland, before written records were being kept in the region. History begins with writing, notes Dr. Langley. And in Scotland, that means history effectively begins with Christianity, which arrived too late to record these earlier population movements. What we're seeing in the DNA might be the only surviving record of a forgotten migration that transformed northern Britain. As compelling as this genetic evidence was, the team knew they needed more than DNA to confirm their hypothesis. They needed to look at what else these eastern migrants might have brought with them, or technologies, cultural practices, or art forms that could connect the Picts to populations further east. This led them to re-examine one of the most distinctive features of Pictish culture: their mysterious system of symbols. On a crisp autumn morning in 2019, Dr. Rachel Zimmerman stood before an audience of the world's leading archaeologists and geneticists at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The anticipation in the room was palpable. For 3 years, her team had worked in relative secrecy, sharing their findings only with a close circle of collaborators. Today, they would present their complete analysis to the world. "What I am about to share with you," she began, "will challenge our understanding of Scottish prehistory. The people we call Picts carried a genetic signature that connects them not just to Western Europe, but to the ancient steppes of Eurasia. They were, in essence, Scotland's hidden migration, a population movement that occurred in the shadows of recorded history." The presentation that followed laid out the genetic evidence in meticulous detail: the higher-than-expected steppe ancestry in Pictish remains, the paternal lineage patterns suggesting male-dominated migration, the geographical and social stratification of the genetic signatures. But it was what came next that transformed a compelling genetic study into a revolutionary reassessment of Pictish origins. Dr. Ian Lawson took the stage after Dr. Zimmerman and projected an image of the Rhynie stone, a Pictish carved stone discovered in Aberdeenshire, featuring a distinctive figure known as the Rhynie man, a figure carrying an axe with a pointed beard and unusual headgear. "We've been staring at these stones for centuries, trying to decipher them through a Celtic lens," he said. "But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction? What if the key to understanding these symbols lies not to the south and west, but to the east?" He then displayed a series of comparative images, Pictish symbols alongside remarkably similar motifs found in the archaeological remains of Scythian, Sarmatian, and other steppe cultures from Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The double disc and zirad symbol that appears on numerous Pictish stones bore striking similarities to solar symbols found on artifacts from the Eurasian steppes. The Pictish beast figures, with their elongated snouts and stylized bodies, shared compositional elements with animal art from the eastern regions. These similarities had been noticed before, Dr. Lawson explained, but they were dismissed as coincidental or as examples of universal symbolic patterns. Now, with the genetic evidence suggesting actual population movement from these regions, we have reason to reconsider these connections. Art historian Dr. Rowan Ziegler, an expert in ancient symbolic systems, had spent the previous year analyzing these parallels. She took the stage next and delivered what many would later call the smoking gun in the case for Eastern influence on Pictish culture. "The Picts used a system of symbols that has long puzzled experts," she explained. "They appear to function not as a narrative art form, but as a form of emblematic communication, possibly representing lineages, titles, or social positions. This system has no clear precedent in Celtic art, which tends toward different organizational principles. But when we look at the Tamga systems of the Eurasian steppe cultures, the emblematic symbols used by Scythians, Sarmatians, and later Turkic peoples to denote clans and lineages, we find a remarkably similar approach to visual communication." She displayed side-by-side comparisons of Pictish symbol pairs with Sarmatian Tamgas from the Black Sea region. The structural similarities were undeniable. Both systems used geometric and zoomorphic elements in standardized combinations that appeared to function as identifiers rather than narrative elements. "What we're suggesting," Dr. Ziegler continued, "is that the Pictish symbol system represents an adapted Tamga system, brought from the East and modified over generations to incorporate local elements and meanings. This would explain why these symbols appear fully formed in the archaeological record with no clear developmental stages. They were an imported symbolic language adapted to a new context. The implications were profound. If both the genetic and symbolic evidence pointed east, this would require a fundamental reassessment of Pictish origins. Rather than seeing them simply as indigenous Britons or Celtic migrants who developed a unique culture in isolation, we would need to recognize them as a hybrid society, one formed by the integration of Eastern migrants with the existing population of northern Britain. Dr. Isaac Langston, a historical linguist who had been working with the team, presented the linguistic evidence next. He had been reanalyzing the limited Pictish language evidence, primarily place names and the few recorded personal names, in light of the new genetic findings. Pictish has traditionally been classified as a Celtic language, related to Welsh and Gaelic, he explained. But there have always been elements that resisted Celtic etymology. Words like pet or pit, that form the basis of many Scottish place names, have no convincing Celtic origin. He displayed a map showing the distribution of these pit names across Scotland. They corresponded almost exactly with the territory historically associated with the Picts. Then he showed comparative linguistic data from Scythian and other Indo-Iranian languages from the steppe regions. What we're proposing is not that Pictish was an Eastern language, but that it was a hybrid primarily Celtic in structure, but incorporating vocabulary and perhaps grammatical elements from the languages of these Eastern migrants. This would explain the linguistic anomalies that have puzzled Celtic scholars for generations. The final presenter was archaeologist Dr. Ruth Zimmerman, who had been re-examining Pictish material culture in light of the genetic findings. She showed evidence of distinctive burial practices, metalworking techniques, and horse equipment that showed parallels with Eastern traditions. The pieces have been hiding in plain sight, she explained. Elements we previously attributed to Roman influence or indigenous development may actually represent cultural practices brought from the East. For example, the Pictish practice of creating underground stone-lined storage chambers, known as souterrains, has closer parallels in Eastern European and Central Asian architecture than in Western European traditions. As the presentation concluded, the room erupted in animated discussion. Some scholars were immediately convinced by the weight of genetic evidence combined with the cultural parallels. Others were more cautious, pointing out that correlation doesn't always indicate causation. But all agreed that these findings demanded serious consideration and further research. Dr. Zimmerman's concluding remarks would become frequently quoted in subsequent academic literature. The Picts were not who we thought they were. They were neither purely indigenous Britons nor simply Celtic migrants. They were the result of a more complex population history, one that connected Scotland not just to Western Europe but to the distant steppes of Eurasia. Their symbols, their genes, and perhaps even fragments of their language point to an Eastern connection that has been hiding in plain sight for over a millennium. The steppe Pict hypothesis, as it came to be known, was born. But verifying it would require more than a single presentation. It would demand a comprehensive reassessment of Scottish prehistory and a research program that integrated genetics, archaeology, linguistics, and art history. In the months that followed, teams across Europe began the painstaking work of testing this new theory. Additional Pictish remains were identified and sampled. Artifacts were re-examined with an eye toward Eastern parallels. Linguistic evidence was reassessed. And slowly, a new picture of Pictish origins began to emerge. One that would fundamentally change our understanding of how Scotland became Scotland. The turning point had arrived. After centuries of mystery, the Picts were finally speaking through their DNA, and their story was far more complex and fascinating than anyone had imagined. By 2021, what had begun as a controversial hypothesis had gained substantial scientific support. Additional genetic samples confirmed the patterns first identified by Dr. Zimmerman's team. Comparative studies of material culture revealed more parallels between Pictish and Eastern steppe traditions. A growing consensus emerged among experts. The Picts represented a unique hybrid society formed through the integration of Eastern migrants with the indigenous and Celtic populations of northern Britain. But what did this mean for our understanding of Scottish history and identity? The implications extended far beyond academic circles. touching on fundamental questions of national origin and cultural heritage. This discovery forces us to reconceptualize the ethnic makeup of early Britain, explains Professor Ryan Zeller, a historian at St. Andrews University who was not involved in the original research, but has since become a leading proponent of the revised Pictish narrative. We can no longer think in terms of a simple Celtic/Germanic division of the British Isles. The genetic evidence tells us that population movements were more complex, with influences coming from multiple directions over thousands of years. For Scotland in particular, this research suggests that its formative cultures were more diverse than previously recognized. The kingdom that would eventually emerge as Scotland wasn't simply the product of Celtic and Germanic migrations from the south and west, but also incorporated significant Eastern influences that arrived via a northern route. This realization has profound implications for how we understand the formation of Scottish identity. The traditional narrative portrayed Scotland as primarily formed through the merging of Celtic Picts with Gaelic settlers from Ireland, the Scoti who gave Scotland its name. The new evidence suggests a more complex fusion of Celtic, Gaelic, and Eastern steppe influences that together created the foundation for Scottish culture. The research also reshapes our understanding of connections across Northern Europe. If the Picts did indeed share genetic and cultural connections with populations in Eastern Europe and possibly Scandinavia, this suggests networks of contact and exchange that predated the Viking Age by centuries. Scotland was not an isolated periphery but part of a wider North Sea and Baltic world with connections stretching far to the east. What's fascinating is how this aligns with certain Norse sagas that hint at pre-Viking contacts between Scandinavia and Scotland, notes Dr. Isaac Lowe, a specialist in Norse literature. These were previously dismissed as legendary embellishments, but perhaps they preserved distant memories of earlier connections between these regions. The implications extend to language as well. If the Pictish language incorporated elements from Eastern Indo-European languages, this would explain why it has been so difficult to classify within the Celtic language family. It may have been a unique hybrid, primarily Celtic but with substrate influence from the languages brought by these Eastern migrants. This linguistic fusion might have influenced the development of Scots, the distinctive Germanic language that developed in Scotland after the Pictish period. Some linguists now speculate that certain distinctive features of Scots might trace back to this earlier period of language contact, providing another layer of connection between modern Scottish culture and its Pictish predecessors. Perhaps most importantly, this research demonstrates how genetic science is revolutionizing our understanding of ancient populations and migrations. Traditional methods of historical and archaeological investigation have limitations when dealing with periods before widespread literacy. DNA analysis offers a new window into these silent periods of human history. What we're seeing with the Picts is likely just one example of many ghost migrations that occurred throughout prehistory, explains Dr. Zimmerman. Movements of people that happened outside the gaze of written records but left their mark in the genetic record of their descendants. We're only now developing the tools to detect and understand these events. The implications for public understanding of Scottish heritage have been significant as well. Museums across Scotland have begun updating their exhibits to incorporate this new understanding of Pictish origins. The National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh now features a display explaining the genetic evidence alongside traditional archaeological artifacts. The public response has been largely positive, with many Scots expressing fascination at this added dimension to their national story. As one visitor to the museum commented, "It makes our history even richer to know we have these connections to such distant parts of the world. It's not diminishing our Scottish identity, it's adding to it." Not everyone has embraced these findings, however. Some nationalist perspectives have resisted the implications of Eastern influence, preferring narratives that emphasize indigenous or Celtic continuity. Others have questioned whether genetic evidence should be given primacy over cultural traditions in defining historical identities. These debates reflect broader questions about how we integrate scientific findings with cultural heritage and identity. Dr. Ian Larson acknowledges these concerns. "We're not saying the Picts weren't Scottish or weren't Celtic in many aspects of their culture. We're saying their origins were more complex than previously understood. Identity is always multifaceted, and the Picts were no exception." The research has also prompted renewed interest in the fate of the Picts. If they were not simply indigenous Britons, but partly descended from more recent migrants with distinctive cultural traditions, why did they disappear so completely from the historical record? The genetic evidence offers some insights into this question as well. The DNA tells us they didn't physically disappear, explains Dr. Zimmerman. Their genetic signatures remain in the modern Scottish population, particularly in the northeast. What disappeared was their distinct cultural identity, as they merged with Gaelic and later Norse influences to form what would become Scottish culture. This perspective suggests that rather than viewing the disappearance of the Picts as a mystery or tragedy, we might better understand it as a transformation, the evolution of one cultural identity into another through processes of cultural exchange, intermarriage, and adaptation. The Picts didn't vanish. They became Scots, contributing their genetic and cultural heritage to the emerging Scottish nation. Beyond Scotland, this research has implications for how we understand population movements across prehistoric Europe. If Eastern steppe influences reached as far as northern Scotland, this suggests more extensive networks of migration and exchange than previously recognized. It challenges simplistic models of European prehistory and highlights the complex patterns of human movement that shaped the continent's genetic and cultural landscape. For archaeologists and historians, the Pictish research demonstrates the value of multidisciplinary approaches that combine genetic science with traditional archaeological methods. Neither approach alone could have revealed the full story. It was the integration of genetic data with archaeological, linguistic, and artistic evidence that created a compelling new narrative. As we continue to develop more sophisticated methods of ancient DNA analysis, we can expect further revelations about other ghost migrations and forgotten population movements. The Pictish story may be just the beginning of a fundamental reassessment of European prehistory, one that recognizes the continent as a dynamic landscape of complex migrations and cultural exchanges stretching back thousands of years. Standing on the windswept hill at Aberlemno in 2023, I watch as Dr. Rachel Zimmerman places her hand on the weathered stone cross that has stood here for over 1,200 years. Carved into its face are the enigmatic symbols that once marked Pictish identity: the double disc, the zerod, the mysterious beasts that defied interpretation for generations. But around these symbols, carved by the same hands, are scenes showing the transition to Christianity, the ultimate cultural transformation that preceded the disappearance of distinct Pictish culture. This stone tells the whole story, Dr. Zimmerman says softly. It shows a people in transition, incorporating new ideas while maintaining connections to their past. The symbols mattered enough to keep carving them even as their meaning was changing. In many ways, this stone embodies the journey we've taken through Pictish history, a story of migrations, cultural fusions, and transformations. The carved symbols that puzzled researchers for centuries now reveal themselves as distant echoes of artistic traditions born on the Eurasian steppes, brought to Scotland's shores by migrants who intermarried with local populations and created something entirely new. The genetic evidence that began this journey of discovery tells us something profound about human identity itself. We are all, in our very DNA, the product of countless migrations, cultural exchanges, and adaptations. The boundaries we draw between cultures, between ethnicities, between nations, these are human constructs imposed upon the complex reality of our shared genetic history. The Picts didn't disappear. Their genetic legacy lives on in today's Scottish population. Their cultural contributions, from their distinctive art to their place names, remain embedded in Scottish heritage. They simply transformed, as all human societies do, adapting to changing circumstances while carrying forward elements of their past. Perhaps this is the most important lesson from the Pictish DNA story. Identity is never static. The people we call Picts were themselves the product of multiple migrations and cultural influences. The Scotland that emerged after them was likewise a fusion of diverse elements. And the process continues today, as modern Scotland continues to evolve and incorporate new influences. As we unravel more ghost migrations through genetic science, we're revealing a human past far more dynamic and interconnected than our traditional historical narratives have recognized. People moved, cultures merged, ideas spread across vast distances. all before written records could capture these transformative events. The story written in our DNA is one of constant movement and exchange, challenging the notion that any of us come from pure or isolated ancestral groups. In the end, the Pictish mystery reveals a universal truth. We are all the inheritors of complex genetic and cultural legacies that transcend the boundaries we've drawn on maps and in our minds. The symbols the Picts carved in stone may remain enigmatic, but their story speaks clearly through their DNA. We are all, in essence, the product of forgotten migrations, cultural crossroads, and the remarkable human capacity to create new identities from diverse origins. As the Scottish mist rolls in over the ancient stone, obscuring its symbols once more, I'm reminded that some mysteries remain and should remain. The precise meanings of individual Pictish symbols may never be fully deciphered. But the broader story of who the Picts were and where they came from has emerged from the genetic mist, reconnecting modern Scots with ancestors whose journeys began thousands of miles away on the distant Eurasian steppes. In our genes, as in the symbols on these ancient stones, the past is never truly lost. It simply waits to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reintegrated into our understanding of who we are and where we come from. The DNA of Scotland's mysterious Picts reveals not just their hidden Eastern origins, but the fundamental truth that human identity itself is a magnificent tapestry woven from countless threads stretching across time and space, connecting us all in ways we are only now beginning to understand.